we decided to have a panel discussion and to flesh out about more what was discussed, especially in our latest session, or our last session this afternoon. And on the panel, we invited not just people, specialists, to talk to us and address these particular issues. And on my left-hand side, Dr. Elmay Kutse-Burgma, that we've always welcomed to our meetings in CropLife SA from Global Gap, which is, from a personal perspective, still the certification body in the world. You heard Paul now. You've heard Kobus Hartman. Lindy Bennick from Waldcrow, that is the sort of market access person for the farmers into any part of the world. And we also have Skalk Skuman. Is Skalk online, Elriza? Dr. Skalk Skuman, he's from the South African Macadamia Producer Organization, a person that also works very much on the ground level with the producer and guiding the producer to make sure they produce their macadamias in order to be able to export to other destinations in the world. And these are the specialists we wanted to bring on board today to discuss certain topics, especially lower down, away from the policy level, at the ground level. But I'm going to start off the discussion by asking a very difficult question. And I'm going to ask Elmay to respond to the question first of all. What mandates the European Union to dictate to other nations of the world how they should produce agricultural crops? It might be a very cheeky question, but I think it's a question that we all ask and might be too afraid to ask. Elmay?
It is a cheeky question, and unfortunately, I cannot speak on behalf of the EU, but I would like to think that they actually have no mandate. They are seen as a nation that have, or European Union as a more than one nation, but they're strong in food safety, they're strong in technology, and they're building many things, and they're in the forefront with all of these things, and they come up with a sustainability agenda. And it's something that all of us think of. I mean, us as South Africans also think about sustainability. Many other countries, it is the topic that everybody is addressing, but they've now put it forward as a Green Deal, and now everybody needs to comply with it. Whether they have the mandate to enforce it to other nations, I don't think so, but it's always a but. If we want to export and if you're part of the game, then you need to follow what the market requires as well. So in the end, it's sort of this indirect enforcement. I think, and this has been said today, overall, everybody said it, us as South Africans, all the other countries, I hear it from New Zealand, from everywhere, are asking the questions, but okay, how is it going to affect us? How do we deal with it? What's the science behind this? All these questions come up. Everybody that I've been talking to and that hear about the Green Deal is, okay, but how are we going to address this? Yes, this is what the EU wants, but how are we going to work around that? So, I mean, even within the EU, Belgium and the Netherlands are fighting on a daily basis to figure out how they are going to deal with this. And yes, they've put it out there, and it seems to be coming. In 8 years' time, they have their first, well, already some of the plans now, but if we think about when we need to be organic and when we need to have the limited pesticides use and all of these things, 8 years from now, we'll have to have these things in place if they succeed in pushing this through. Some of our European retailer members have told us recently that with the war in Ukraine, they probably won't have products in their stores because there's the energy crisis. So it's going to delay some of these deadlines, I'm sure. And things like organic, they've all noticed that there's a decrease in the organic production that they can source from. So even though this is being pushed through by the Green Deal, we see the opposite. So that leads me to Paul's presentation, your one slide on all the push and pulls that we have, and everything is contradicting. I mean, it's all the buzzwords, and they try to put everything in place, and all of us are trying to make sense of it, but in reality, things are not working according to that plan, it seems like.
In other words, you say we should all accept that the EU doesn't have a mandate to dictate to anybody. But they set the platform, and what Elmay says is now, how do we position ourselves to be able to still talk to the platform and service the platform and get our money out of the European Union? But in inverted commas, semi-glad to hear that there's discontent in the ranks. In other words, even within the EU, there are companies that say, but we don't want this to happen. And maybe this is something where we need to talk to the advocacy people and say, but how do we pick out those countries and start making connection with them and try and use them as a channel to lobby into the whole European Union and say, but this is not a workable idea. If you don't even have, we spoke today a lot about bundling ourselves together as a front to address the European Union Green Deal. Now, in the European Union, they didn't even have their own total united front. So maybe that's something we should latch on and see how we can negotiate that particular little gap in their own approach and maybe use it to our advantage. I don't know whether, Lindy, would you like to respond to that and add on to what Elmay said about the mandate of the EU and whether the EU is all on the same planet, which I heard now from Elmay. It's not the same story. They're not really all on the same level with that.
Gerard, it's not one of the ones that I prepped for, but at the same time, it's always difficult in a panel. I think we've all heard all the stories today in the first session, setting the scene, the second session, the challenges we sit with, regulatory issues. And I've always said, I mean, if we really look at what the EU is doing, we all know, if you look at the COP27 that's just taken place, many parties have looked at some elements because we're all having some impact of climate change. But the real issue behind it is EU wants to be the first climate neutral. To the detriment of others, they don't really care. We all know that with regard to them pushing these issues, are they really? We heard today about 19 countries that have put comments forward on 2 actives. Do they really care what other countries are doing at this stage? Not really. One thing I can say to you, there's nothing to add from what Kobus has said or what Paul has said. We all know these things are already having impacts. We know we've had an increasing loss of critical actives. It's not the Green Deal that started the process. I already said many years ago this started. There's been an intensified loss of actives based on the hazard principles. South Africa has, in many ways, been able to adapt to using actives. Kobus highlighted a few actives where we can still use products with those changes. The reality is we are going to see losses. We're going to see, we don't have the tools. We need new technologies that are going to cost more. There's going to be increased costs. And if I look at it at the moment, we heard what Paul said. We've just had a roadshow that Hortgrow has done. And the summary of it is that I'm hearing, firstly, some areas have had huge hail losses. Some areas have got farms that are on the market, they can't get market prices. Some areas they're pulling out trees. And when you really look at these issues, it's really about the sustainability. At which end? Who carries these costs? It's the growers that are going to carry these costs. They always have. And it's already unsustainable. And the EU is going to continue pushing those issues. We're going to have to find ways around them. The challenge is we don't have the funding, as you've highlighted.
One thing you said now, which interests me a lot, is even if we go the route with a good, solid scientific evidence to say, but you cannot take the compound off, there's no reason to take it off the market, and we've got the people that do the lobbying and the advocacy and stuff, you tell me that they still don't care. They don't care about what happens with the farm on the ground. That's what I get from what you said now.
Well, I mean, we can see that's the reality. That Paul and Kobus can comment on that. We've had, who is absorbing most of these input costs? The grower. The grower has always been the one that's absorbing increased costs,
to
the point that it's not sustainable anymore. How long have we had loss of actives? It's an ongoing and increasing situation. Is the EU taking note of any of the arguments that are being put forward on these issues? Not really.
Okay.
So I think that's the reality. I'm not saying we mustn't have a position. I very much think that this is the time, as I said this morning, for us to work together to try and shape the words that Alan used, what they're trying to do, and to ensure that before we have any trade negotiations where we have things included in our negotiations that we can't meet, that we can try and shape it. But that's the reality. That's what you are dealing with.
Thank you for that. Is Skalk online? You down there in Lowveld as far as I know. Hello, Skalk. I can see you.
Sorry,
Skalk,
I had a bit of a feedback loop, and I think it's sorted.
what we're discussing now, and you heard what El May said, and you heard what Lindy said, and I would like to know from you, with your engagement with your macadamia farmers on the ground, what is your feeling about the EU trying to dictate to us how do we produce that nut on the ground? And do they actually care about what's going to happen to that macadamia producer that might be put out of business if they come with these, call them harsh measures? Can I get your response on that one, please?
Gerard, yes, sorry, I was a bit out of the initial bit of the discussion, but I have a firm opinion on this one. I don't think there's at this moment, if you look at the problems facing the macadamia industry, most of it is due to indigenous insects, and then also a range of diseases that's fairly unique to our environment, and some of these restrictions placed by the EU on us are really going to make life extremely difficult. With that, I must say that the mac industry has adopted, integrated pest management and all related matters in leaps and bounds. The industry has really flown through the sort of traditional succession of approaches to crop protection, and at this moment really is grasping the integrated approach. But I think these things are most certainly going to make it a lot more difficult for our growers, Gerard, if it answers your question. And it's a lot wider than just the South African growers, because I am just about to leave for Kenya, and it's going to affect the African growers as well. Macadamias is fast becoming a major crop in southern Africa, I would say from Kenya down towards the eastern seaboard. So it is really going to affect growers on a fairly large scale.
Okay, Skalk, thanks for that. I want to keep you on the line there in terms of the question I want to latch on to the mandate of the EU, and that is also maybe a difficult question. The producer on the ground, and maybe we should not only say South African producer, because Skalk now alluded to other nations in Africa that also impacted by the Green Deal. Are these farmers on the ground aware about the Green Deal and what the potential impact is in, call it the short to medium term, on their sustainability and their livelihoods? Or is there the sort of what we call in South African terms the ostrich head in the sand syndrome? So, Skalk, would you like to respond to that? And I'm going to ask Paul also, because you are directly in contact with your citrus growers. So, could you maybe respond to that, please, Skalk?
Yeah, Gerard, now that's a leading question if I've ever heard one. No, Gerard, we've been trying to communicate, or we're not trying, we have been communicating with our growers for some time now. But my honest opinion is that they're not aware of the serious nature of what is coming during the next few years. We've been pressing the IPM and sustainability button for quite some time, and I think, dare I say the words, so the farmers have become desensitized maybe in some respect. And with all that, I would really like to compliment what you have done today. I really found it extremely insightful, and I think it's really, really, really practical stuff that will have a huge impact on our growers. Gerard, no. Summarize. I don't think despite a lot of effort from our side, I don't think the majority of the growers are totally aware of what's happening.
Skalk, while you were talking, I looked around my fellow panel members here, and I saw a nod from El May and I saw a nod from Kobus, and that's very worrying to me. So I'm going to avoid these two now for the moment and ask Paul, because you are dealing with this massive group of citrus growers. So same question to you. What is your experience?
Yeah, I think it will depend on sector, definitely. I think majority probably, I'm talking across the board, aren't really aware. But the part of the challenge that I mentioned in my talk is, what do you communicate? You tell them, okay, it's coming, but there's nothing really to point to specifically. That makes it that messaging quite difficult, and it's obviously linked to the uncertainty in the whole process. From a fruit point of view, I think we actually have been better off in terms of the broader topics around the Farm to Fork and Green Deal, in the sense, like, for example, the Confronting Climate Change, that was started in 2008. It's got 10 years, 12 years worth of data sitting there and being able to show evidence, and that's a good news story. That's something we can tie in with some of our communication. From the citrus industry point of view, our board picked up that we needed to focus on this. We brought it to their attention, and we have a strategic plan for that's covering 4 years. So we've got a deliberate effort within our organization to communicate around the impacts of the European Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategy, and part of that was the development of the Citrus Sustainability Forum, which is we meet about every quarter, and it started at the beginning of last year. So there are deliberate attempts to communicate, and within those structures, and obviously now more specifically on citrus, we can start talking about the specific aspects of it. I mean, this last one last week, Sean Moore actually gave a whole presentation on integrated pest management and sort of what the dynamics around that. So, from a citrus point of view, I think we're doing quite a lot. We could probably do more, but that's well, I'll leave it for there. Yeah.
All right, but now, having listened to your response to this particular difficult question, whose fault is it that the farmers are uninformed or disconnected with what's happening in the European Union? Can we lay the blame at the level of the farmer? Is it the grower groups? Is it the level of government? Is it, for example, us at CropLife SA? Is it the broader agriculture arena? Why do we have this particular problem? Who do we pinpoint as saying, but you should have started the advocacy to the farm level about this months ago, or maybe a year or two ago?
I think he's looking at you, Kobus.
Yeah, well,
I want the guilty part here.
I think that a very prominent South African, and I will refrain from using his name, at some stage one of the richest people in South Africa said to me one day, "It's easy to be ethical if you're rich." And then he turned around and he said, "I haven't been rich all my life." I think farmers are struggling to a large extent with their budgets. The bottom line is, can they really afford to listen to all this what's now? And in the end of the day, how do they survive? In the battle for survival, I've seen many of my own clients across the country battling for survival, driving very nice cars, but I know that the bank would refuse them the next loan to buy the packing material. Under those conditions, though, I think the one thing is, and I'm avoiding your question to some extent, but under those conditions, you will find many guys are able to produce fruit with zero residues or with very low residues. And as far as the regulatory side of things are concerned, just ignore the fact that it might not be Global Gap compliant, or it might not be Act 36 compliant, or whatever. As long as the fruit can be sold, they're very happy to go ahead and do that. And they will continue doing that until specific laws and activities come into place which says, sorry, you can't go any further. And I'm not speaking on behalf of farmers. Certainly there are other people, certainly there are a lot of them out there that would follow the rules to a large extent. But those are the ones that are most probably the rich ones, or the ones that can afford to do that. The end of the day is, who is responsible to carry this message forward? All of us, and we've been sitting here this morning listening, most of us, to new information. All of us would like to reveal this information to our growers and our clients and our associates out there. But we are also still in a phase of, in a gray area where we don't really know. One might know a lot more than the other, and of each and every bit together. And I think, and that the Skalk has alluded to that, if we get these grouped together more often, if we can get these people to speak about the problems more often, I think there could be a uniform message going out to growers. And as long as you keep on informing growers, there will be slow but surely changes happening. My problem is that the change that is going to happen might be too slow to meet what the regulators are about to do. Because there's less than a year, or there's a little bit more than a year left before, if these things come to fruition, a lot of very critical registrations are going to be cancelled, which does not mean you can't use it anymore. It will simply not be available to use anymore. And we don't have suitable alternatives. So what are the growers going to do? They will, for the short term, just revert to different markets. But the moment you put citrus into the eastern or in the Far East markets, you start flooding that sensitive markets. Or you go to the Americas, you run into phytosanitary problems and long dispatch times. You go to the UK, well, I don't know. I believe Cyril Ramaphosa has just clinched a deal with the UK government to sell double the amount of wine to them. Maybe they will be so intoxicated that they will suddenly start buying our fruit at a high price. But fact of the matter is, if I look at the arrogance of markets, for instance, not only of the countries, or of the regulatory authorities. So I've recently listened to one of the supermarkets, and I'm involved with many of them in the UK. I've recently listened to one where the grower was interrogated by the buyer, saying, "I've got this checklist. You tell me how often do you go to the UK? You tell me what status is your aeroplane ticket? Is it business class or is it economic class? If it's business class, why do you fly business class? Where do you live when you're in there?" Once he's completed that checklist of about 20, 25 questions, the supermarket will then draw a line and say, "Okay, your cost of production is this, I will allow you 5% on that." And that was a generous one. And that's it. And he will then dictate to that grower what price is he going to give, is he going to pay him. I think it's bordering on the level of intolerable that you can dictate to people like that and dictate to growers like that. But simultaneously, at the time they were doing that, they were struggling with eggs on the shelves. They didn't have milk on the shelves. They didn't have potatoes on the shelves because of their very intelligent Brexit deal. And they were running with trucks standing from here to Timbuktu on the French border. They couldn't get the stuff over, but yet they were dictating to growers on this. There's a distortion in the world as far as that is concerned.
If I now listen to what all of you said up until what Kobus said now, I get the impression that the farmer is so overburdened with all these regulations and sub-regulations and markets that demand certain things that the farmer might be pulling back and going behind the curtain and say, "But I just want to be a farmer. I don't want to be cluttered with all that sort of stuff." And that's maybe what happens. And I remember in my young days when I was a student, I used to work on the macadamia farms, banana farms in the north, in Levubu. That was 40 years ago. It was wonderful. You planted, you harvested. Now, you got to be an entomologist, you got to be a plant pathologist, you got to be economist, you got to be a market player, you got to have people that are CAs in your company. So now farming is not about producing anymore. It becomes a mission to be a farmer. And on top of that, we've got this negative perception of farming in the world. So people all want to eat, but they don't like the farmer. So maybe that's why farmers are reluctant to open their ears to the bit of information that we as an audience have been able to get to them. And maybe we should just soften the message and go out again and sort of sensitize it to them that this is something we have to look for, because we cannot lose our markets to the European Union or wherever else, because my worry is if the EU gets the way, it might then follow in the Americas, it might then follow on in the East. But the other question which latches onto this is there currently, I'm not talking about future, but is there currently a strategy that farmers could deploy to overcome the hurdles currently set to us by the European Union? And maybe then in the shorter term future, when the Green Deal starts to become more of a reality, we know it's a reality, but when it becomes more reality, is there a way that they can currently work with our current complement of plant protection products to overcome that and still use them without jeopardizing the access to market?
I don't
Lindy,
think,
maybe
yeah.
let's give
Now,
Lindy a chance.
Gerrit, I'm going to come in here now because I think we all keep talking EU, but we also heard from Sarah's side, thanks Sarah for chairing that work group, that potentially we've got bigger concerns that are going to impact on us within South Africa. So as I tried to say earlier on, we have seen loss of critical actives over the past few years and increasing numbers of critical actives in the EU context. The reality is, over the next 2 years, we might lose critical actives that we cannot use in South Africa. And what's even more concerning to me is, or not concerning, but I think it's very important that we work collectively to understand what's already on SA growers, or what impacts the EU Green Deal loss of actives already has on growers, on the ability to produce crops, on the ability to manage key pests and diseases. In the case of citrus, to manage critical phytosanitary pests. In the case of stone fruit, to manage critical phytosanitary pests going to the EU. But also to be cognizant of the fact that if there are going to be phase out of those critical actives, that's going to have even greater impact on the ability to control various pests and diseases in South Africa, and to at least have an understanding from a regulatory perspective. Yes, there are some actives that will need to be phased out, but at least have an understanding of the need for time to adjust to those requirements before the phase out is just put on us 2 years' time with no alternatives on hand to be able to address those concerns. So for me, it's not only about what the EU is doing, it's about what the EU is doing on top of what is going to be happening within South Africa over the next 2-3 years, which will have even greater impact. As we've already tried to point out, currently, even though products are non-approved for EU use, if products' MRLs drop to limit of quantification or determination at 0.01, we still have an ability. Chlorpyrifos is a very good example. We've still been able to use chlorpyrifos in our dormant applications as a very critical pest. Kobus will be able to elaborate. But the fact that it's being phased out, we can't use it anymore in future. And that's, to me, a greater issue that lies ahead of us, a bigger concern. So for me, it's very important that regulators in South Africa, or the registrar, also understands potential implications that are going to be on growers. And not only that, but as an industry association, you ask, do growers know? I think some of us around here have sleepless nights. I have sleepless nights when I worry about the loss of potential actives, new diseases. And there's a sort of an expectation created that we can do something that's going to really change the EU. The reality is we can be blue in the face and we won't be able to change what the EU does on some of these things. So there needs to be an understanding going forward that we might have to work with loss of critical actives, Kobus, but how we can try and use a toolbox that allows us to continue producing our crops with available tools in South Africa and with those reduced requirements.
I have a thing to add on there, but let me just first see what Paul wants to say, please.
Yeah, thanks. Just 2 points. I think what we've done in the citrus industry through a parallel process with the forum is linking up with the researchers and actually assessing all our actives and looking what the future looks like and trying to anticipate if it went, what would be backup and what, you know, and that obviously feeds into more research, etc. We're fairly lucky in the citrus industry. We can really work closely with CRI on that. What worries me a little bit, touching on what you were saying, you know, to what extent is the grower responsible and what can he really do? There's an aspect of this that's worrying me a little bit in the sense that we might find growers trying to do too much, trying to experiment, actually. You know, so you lose an active and now you try. And one of the consequences of the finance, the cheap finance coming out of Europe is a lot of products and a lot of marketing around products being done, even in South Africa, for so-called more environmentally friendly alternatives, which either simply don't work or they've got other challenges. And you need the robust science to actually demonstrate that those aren't actually effective or good options. And so there's an aspect of leaving it up to the grower that worries me, because they're not really always in the best position to be making good decisions. And if they're getting a lot of things thrown at them from a big marketing budget, that does worry me quite a lot.
Okay, so Kobus, give me a second just to put my mind around this. Lindy opened up my thought process that yes, there's a concern about what the EU does because it might affect our exportability to the European Union and maybe the longer term to other markets. But it comes back to what the European Union position is on our own regulatory affairs, because it seems to us now, and maybe right or wrong for what I'm saying here, is that the European Union position started influencing the minds of our own regulators to say, but if you have this list of CMRs that are not going to be out of the European Union, we must implement the same policy and regulations in Africa. And that's what Lindy says. Automatically, we even without thinking it, adopted the mirror clause from the European Union, which I don't think was ever the intention, but that's the way we see it happening at the state level or the government level, and that is, I think, of grave concern. And you mentioned the word chlorpyrifos, and I learned from Kobus over many years of being associated with him that if you have a problem with an MRL in the European Union, you can work your way around to working with the PHRs and so on to still meet the requirement, and you can even say Africa work your way around to have it here. But what happens if the European Union says chlorpyrifos is out there? It comes back as a mirror clause, chlorpyrifos is out in South Africa, which we know has gone out. What does the farmer do? And then Paul says, now automatic to get, and let me use the nasty term here, the fly-by-nights coming in with a so-called natural or biological or organic remedy that can do the job for you, and they market like mad. The farmer buys, experiment, and the crop fails bitterly, and the farmer doesn't even have to export because there's nothing to export. So the farmer are at the mercy of people that fill the gap that's created by a regulatory decision where you lose a compound, and they come with all these smelly, sniffy stuff that's not peer-reviewed scientifically, that's not proven scientifically, and the farmer starts experimenting, and they lose their crop. Not even the market, they lose the entire crop. So that is something which we see happening very much in the Western Cape, because I get the complaints from our members and farmers and stuff about unregistered stuff. And the unregistered chemical stuff is minimal. The unregistered biologicals, it's cans full. And if you look at the stuff, who knows what it is? You don't even know what is on the packaging label, and what you don't even know what's in the container. Who's it going to work? But the farmers are now at the point of being desperate to get a replacement for what they're going to lose and try and still maintain the market. So this is, it's opening up, I think, a new can of worms. But Kobus, you had something to add there.
Gerard, yeah, just a point in case. One of my clients has got 40 hectares of table grapes. He's been farming that for 5 years, and then abruptly decided he's going to cut it all down and plant tobacco instead. Now, there's an ethical issue about tobacco as well. That's not the discussion. The reason why he cut it down is he had 1 year of crop failure, total crop failure, due to the use of a so-called organic program. He was convinced by a seller to use this program because that will give him better market access. Now, he was ignorant enough to believe that he would have better market access. There's no such a thing. If you've got market access, you've got market access. If you're pregnant, you're pregnant. How much more can you be pregnant? And the issue was he lost 1 year of production, and he could just simply not survive on that. Afterwards, he couldn't survive, and he cut the grapes down. That is on the one side of things, and I'm hellish scared that, as you both have alluded to, it will open the market for opportunists to proliferate. The regulation, on the regulatory side, things are not as tough as on the conventional side, chemistry. There are new regulations coming into place, but it's not as tough as on the conventional side. So, and one of the things are, for instance, the toxicology of those things. I mean, you're a toxicologist. Don't tell me that the so-called natural products are not toxic. If you want, the most toxic substances are natural. If you don't want to believe me, Ga speel met 'n pofadder man. Jy gaan sien. And the problem is that in the end of the day, those chemicals could be extremely toxic, and we don't know. We don't know what the residues are of those things. We don't know what the impact on the buyer would be on the end of the day, what the interaction with other chemistry is going to be. But we're drifting far away from your initial question, which says who's responsible and how can we get the grower to know more. Even if the grower knows more, he couldn't do much more. He can only struggle for survival. And I think what we as an industry and as a collective group need are more Alan whatevers over there that are eloquent, that can speak good English, that knows his stuff, and that can speak directly to authorities. Because it's no good each and every one of us trying to go and convince the people on the other side. All that they will do is they will search out the common denominator, that's the weakest link, and they will capitalize on that one. If you can come with one message, one story, and a very strong story and a well-informed story, and we all have a responsibility to ensure that guy goes along with a good story, then we make an impact. And especially if our story is based on good science and facts, not hocus-pocus ideas, facts. And I cannot emphasize the whole idea of good science enough. You guys are very fortunate in the CGA that you've got the CRI at least on one side. We've got universities in the west, in the south, in the Western Cape. We've got Tech, Grow, Lindy, your team that commissions a lot of good research. And I think in the end of the day, we need to collate that information, make sure that information is well understood, transferred to the growers, and get one message to whoever we use as the lobbyist on the other side, not with the idea to lobby like the Americans lobby, with the idea to inform. And I'm pretty sure that the EU is not that draconic. Yes, there's a strong element of politics involved, but I don't think it's entirely draconically decision-making and uniform decision-making. Yes, they are inclusive to a large extent, but Alan, I'm pretty sure you will agree that if you come with a good message, and I found it often in the past, if you come with a good message, they will listen. Because 99% of the time that you have a distortion, it's because of lack of information.
Okay, Kobus. So you come again with two messages. The one message is to get everybody together to talk the same language with the same message. But on top of that, you latched onto Alan now and get the right person to transfer the message. In other words, if all of us decide we have the same sort of plate of food to offer the European Union, but we all go individually, it's not the right approach. We must all put together one food basket and give it to one person to go and dish up at the European Union. And that's why I think in the future we might need to get much closer to a proper advocacy person like Alan, to talk on behalf of the entire South African agriculture arena and not go 1, 2, 3, 4 and go and try and influence the European Union and do it that way. But I also got from you now, Kobus, and from the others around the floor now that there's not much the farmer can do. Because if we lose a particular product, what can the farmer do? That thing is completely gone. And I'm sad to say, back in my younger days, in the year 2002, I got a real bee in my bonnet about monochlorophos, and I lobbied like mad to get it off the market. But we had a 4-year strategy. In other words, to look at phasing it out and bring something in behind it. And unfortunately now, it's not the norm anymore. Now it's a case of you lose it, and us as the state or the government don't allow anything behind it because we don't have the capacity to regulate properly, we don't have enough staff to evaluate new technology behind it, so we're in a different sort of playing field at the present. So the poor farmer, wherever he or she is in Africa for that matter, other places in the world, is left without a strategy to overcome this nasty thing of the EU, which reflects back on South Africa and say, but if the EU says that, we will do it the same year. So we are in a real problem. But it leads me on to my fourth question. We've gone now from a policy level to a group level to the individual farmer. What about the person who eats the food? How will all of this influence the consumer who relies on that farm on the ground producing the max or the citrus or the wheat, whatever? How will it influence my ability to still have a sustainable and affordable and a safe food source? Anybody would like to respond to that?
I think you must just ask the ones that are hungry.
Pardon?
I see. If you ask the people that are hungry, they will ignore whatever embargo you put on the product and the safety and all of that stuff. They will bloody well eat to their fill. I think to a large extent our first world consumer have become is a wealthy consumer. It's to a large extent the guys that are willing to pay a lot of money for produce are wealthy consumers. So they have got a lot of choice, but they've got a lot of opinions. Many of those opinions are not science-based. It's pseudoscience. It's driven it's absolutely driven by so-called consumer watchdogs. If I look at the German supermarkets, I'm convinced that 80% of the decision-making that takes place and the distortion in the German supermarkets are driven by consumer watchdogs, not by science. So, but if you are really hungry, would you listen to a pseudoscientist? Or you just get what you eat? Can you take what you get?
Yeah, okay, but you might not as a consumer listen to the pseudoscientists. My worry is, me as a normal consumer, irrespective of your cultural background or your economic level, will I still be able to get the food required to keep myself, my family going? That is the big question.
If you have these, all these rules that we're talking about, you might run out of food at some stage. You might run out of the selection of produce. You might, in the end of the day, have only, who said to it, you must eat less meat and less vegetables, and I'm very happy about that, because that would mean that the meat will get cheaper and the vegetables more expensive. So I'll go for the cheaper stuff. No, somebody around the table said that this afternoon. It's not my idea.
There's a question there.
I just want to, there might be a question from Florman. Just ask Elmay, with all your contacts and your connections across the globe, do you see places where there's already a food shortage at the consumer level because of the possible influence of the Green Deal concept and flowing down to regulatory affairs at a national level?
Not really. I think the consumer isn't really aware of any of these things. I tend to agree here with Kobus in terms of the consumer watchdogs, that they put the ideas into the heads of the retailers on what is it that the consumer wants. I mean, we've discussed many times with them, but what is it that the consumer really wants? We update our standards, we look into legislations, we do all these things, talking about sustainability now all the time. But what is it that you really need? What is it that, I mean, we build the standards based on what the retailers want and what the producers can do, deliver, auditable, all the practicalities behind that. But if we ask the retailers, okay, but what is it that you need? They say, oh, the consumers want this and this and this. Like, okay, do you have surveys? How do you know that this is what they want? And it's driven by certain agendas. We know that. I don't think the consumers are. And yes, they will see shortages in places on foods being available. As I mentioned before, things will change. But the one thing that we don't know is whether a retailer will be so adamant to say, okay, I will have an empty shelf because I cannot get something that is legally produced or safely produced or whatever, hopefully safe. I almost think we should have safe food, right?
I think we should eliminate that.
That's not debatable,
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
But I mean, whether it's with X, Y, and Z and all the requirements that's coming into place, whether they just want the safe food basically there. So, yeah, it's a debatable question.
Gerard, I saw a good example of that. Let's say 20 years ago, because before Toyota dominated the market, if you go to Springbok, you would find everybody driving around a Land Rover. If you go to Uppington, you will find them driving Fords. And the only reason for that dichotomy is that you've got a bloody good salesman in Springbok, and you've got a better one on Fords in Uppington. The net effect is exactly what Elmi is saying. Consumers eat what the supermarkets give them, and they have maybe a little bit of choice of their own. But if you have one supermarket dominating a particular environment and area, those are the ones that dictate the pace. And those are the ones that, look at the German supermarkets. I mean, it's a competition between the German supermarkets with less and less and less MRLs, less and less residues. If you go to the UK, they don't bother, but yeah, they talk about these things. But the consumers are not so concerned. Even the Lidls in the UK differ from the Lidls in Germany and in Holland.
Okay.
So I think to a large extent, it's a competitive environment where supermarkets compete with one another on the basis of food safety, which is ridiculous. In an area or in an era when we talk about food shortages and we talk about waste and we talk about expensiveness, we are still basing our competitive advantage on sensitive, perceptive issues like food safety. I mean, again, you're a toxicologist. How much safer can the food be after it's gone through 17, 18, 20 top-grade toxicologists in EFSA? And the MRLs are being set, the RFDs are being set, everything is being set, but now you want to reduce it with 2/3 to only 1/3 of the MRL.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you from a toxicological perspective, looking at the human population development over the world, if our food was so unsafe, why did we hit the 8 billion mark of the human population in the world a week or two ago? And we know that they talk about 2025, we're going to hit 8.5 billion. So if the food was so unsafe, why do we see this escalation in human population? There's something which doesn't gel in the entire argument. And I agree with what El May said, and I agree with what Kobus said, and I even do in my own presentation to students that this whole thing is not science-driven. It is market-driven. So the market tells the people, tells Les, this is what you should eat because it is safer for you. But I give you a 20% markup on it because I tell you it's safer. So there's a conditioning of the consumer, and then the market used to say, but our consumers want this. No, the consumer wants something which is edible, affordable, safe, and tasty. They don't worry about whether there's 0.001 ppm or 0.01 ppm or stuff, as long as it is affordable. And unfortunately, I think the economics dictate the market. But before I talk too much, was there a question or an input from the floor? Ben Kroch, can somebody please pass Ben? If you got one, Ben. Thank you, Ben. Just give it some power there, please.
Hello, yeah. Thank you, Gerard. Yes, I think we must just maybe be careful to generalize. You know, if and when there is pressure on our critical chemical compounds, we will have to look broader for alternative crop protection solutions in our IPM programs. As an example, there are biological and biorational products that's been scientific peer-reviewed. And I'm just feeling that we must rather work together than against each other, because I think the future there's a lot of opportunities in investigation into the biological and biorational solutions. So I'm just feeling that we mustn't say they or us or the chemicals versus the biologicals. But I do agree with you, Gerard, on there's a lot of there's some sort of biological companies within South Africa that's taking the shortcuts, using the M registrations and making L registration claims. I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and that's why within CropLife we've got now the Biological Forum to get more companies on board to state their case going forward.
Thank you, Ben. I think it's good that you brought up this topic of biological versus biological. Now, in CropLife, we've always had the policy or position that to us, as CropLife Africa, there's no difference between a synthetic chemical, a natural chemical, a natural plant extract remedy, or a biological. They all serve the purpose of assisting the farmer to produce a crop safely and affordably. But we've had an issue with this idea that biologicals, organics are safer. It's not the case. And listen to what Kobus says, and I don't want to give you a lecture on toxicology now because it's not the platform. But we maintain the policy that when you want to put a biological in the market, it has to go through the same fine sieve as what you do for a pesticide. There might be a reason to ask for an exemption on certain toxicological data or residue data because it's biological, but don't come to me as a toxicologist or to CropLife for that matter and say, but I got a biological, it's safe, let's go into the market. It cannot be. And I'm proud to say that in South Africa, within CropLife, we have a lot of members, like, for example, Ben from one of our member companies, that focus on biological remedies, that go through extensive research, and they take up to 7 years before they get the product ready for the market, then go through the typical regulatory process that anything like a chlorpyrifos would have to go through. And the farmers can trust it because it's been proven, it's been scientifically established, it can do the job in an IPM program. So, Ben, I think it's a good thing to put that into the discussion. Maybe the last...
Just before Ben gets off the hook, he was correctly referring to biologicals and biorationals, and I referred to that in the speech myself. Ben, het jy mooi geluister het, so jy geluister het, ek het in goeie trou daaroor gepraat. Fact is, simultaneously referring to, let's say, weaker biologicals, we should also refer to weaker conventional compounds. There are many guys that jump through there are many products at this point in time, and there are many practices in this point in time that is absolutely horrifying me. Yesterday, I listened to a grower which compared two spray programs on potatoes. The one was working well on potato tuber moth, and the other one was not working that well on potato tuber moth. The one that was not working well was following let's say, a traditional approach towards potato tuber moth control. The one that was working well had 11 sprays of the same compound applied 11 times after each other. And it is absolutely horrifying to think that that grower, of that individual that had made that recommendation, would totally screw up the whole concept of resistance and would put the farmer out of an opportunity to repeat that thing again and plant potatoes there again. There are many, many examples of that. There are also, unfortunately, fewer but examples of opportunists in the biorational biological environment. And I'm proud to say that there are also many very good biological companies out there bringing stuff to the market. And it is a pity that they too are being subjected to lengthy evaluation processes. We need those products as much as we need the conventionals. And I was alluding to it, maybe in the form of replacements, but also in the form of hybrids, which in the nearby future could serve us well by reducing residues or even eliminating residues. And the problem is exactly the same as with our conventional products. You can't necessarily always believe the trial results. And I'm saying that with apprehension.
Thank you, Cobus, and thank you, Ben. A last question to Elmay, a 30-second response. We have Global Gap, been around for ages. So Global Gap, from my personal perspective, we're not talking about CropLife, has established a platform for good agricultural practice, sound and effective and safe use of pesticides. Why do we still need another regulator out there? Why do we need another EU Green Deal? Why do we need, I don't want to go to all these things, farming for the future, all these things, the Rainforest Alliance, where you farm in the middle of Karoo, what the hell has got the Rainforest Alliance doing there? Do we really need an additional level of control above the platform that was established by Global Gap? Elmay, you can give me a personal opinion or a Global Gap opinion.
I think it's the same one. Gerard, that is difficult to answer, and I think the answer lies in the fact that you're not the one deciding what's needed. There's competition out there, so we're just a standard setter. Yes, I also believe we have a good standard that covers sort of everything. We're a global standard, therefore we need to be generic. We want to be science-based. We want to be risk-based and outcome-based. So that producers, doesn't matter if they're in South Africa, Kenya, China, Europe, wherever, that they can produce safe food in a sustainable way, but in the way that is logical and practical and pragmatic in their environment. that is our ultimate aim and goal. So for me, that makes perfect sense, and I don't understand why there are more standards out there, but there are, and this is because retailers want to be individuals, they want to have things on top, because they all want to have that unique selling point or something. And it's just a matter of competition, and everybody wants to have a say somewhere in life to make a point.
Okay.
So that's
Thank
my
you.
personal opinion part.
Thank you.
But
All right.
I would like to say, we said before that there's not much producers can do in this whole thing. Yes, it's very true. But I do think we still have an obligation. I would love it if CropLife can take some role in that, for education and communication to producers to understand not necessarily the Green Deal and all the bigger picture things, but the reasons why, what is resistance building, what is IPM? Yes, they know little bits and pieces of it, but in the case that you just mentioned, the producer, why does he even think that applying one chemical 7 times would be a good thing? Does he ask the right questions to the suppliers? Ben is doing a good job, the next guy is doing a bad job, but much cheaper, so the producers just go for the cheap option. Sorry, I'm generalizing, I'm calling out names, but this is the reality. The farmer's also just going to go for the cheapest way out because things get more expensive, more difficult, there's more things to comply with. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to educate and communicate.
Thank you. Well, one of the pillars of CropLife is actually to influence people and to educate people. Maybe the word educate might sound a bit harsh on the other farmer, but we rather talk about that awareness, creating awareness. And the word that we got from Alan today, that advocacy. So advocacy is not only aimed at states and governments and EU, it's also aimed at the farmer, advocate what is good agricultural practice and so on. So on that note, thank you, Almay, thank you, Paul, thank you, Kobus, thank you, Lindy. I think it was a fruitful discussion, and thank you, Ben, for putting that last comment in